Okay, so as I predicted in the last episode, we were introduced to Numenor in episode 3, and the Numenor plotline replaces the Elrond and Gil-galad plot from episodes 1 and 2. Numenor looks beautiful. It's more or less what I pictured it to look like. I think they did a better job here than they did with the city of Tirion in Valinor. Though while I do think the architecture, the ships, the armor look great, everything is perfect except for the main Numenorian characters. Minus Isildur, I don't have any problem with his interpretation yet, other than the fact that he shouldn't even be born during this time. For one thing, and it's annoying that I have to talk about this again, but Numenor is not really a multicultural society. Numenor, as somewhat correctly stated by Galadriel and Miriel, the Queen Regent, were given to the men that aided the Eldar or Elves and the Valar or gods against Morgoth in the First Age. They were given the island of Numenor to live on as a gift, it being the most western land for mortals and the closest human land to Valinor, also known as the Undying Lands. Elves from the Undying Lands would periodically show up to educate and enrich the culture of the Numenorians, as well as to teach them about the Valar. This is one aspect that made the Numenorians high men, while the other groups of men left on Middle-earth were known as middlemen and lowmen. The other aspect of this was that they were granted longer lifespans, especially the line of Elros, the brother of Elrond, who, when given the choice by the Valar to be a man or an elf, Elros chose to be a man, though he still retained a longer lifespan due to his elven heritage, and thus Elros became the first king of Numenor. But back to the original men, there were roughly 3 tribes of men known as the Edain who made up the army of men that aided the Eldar against Morgoth. These 3 houses were known as the House of Hodor, described as blonde and blue-eyed, House of Beor, described as dark hair and gray eyes, resembling the Noldor, and the House of Haleth, who in terms of appearance are simply described as being similar to the Beorians. There was a 4th group of men, known as the Druidine, or woodmen, also wild men, a very small amount of whom joined the House of Haleth, of whom also had a very small number join the other 2 houses on Numenor, as many of the House of Haleth had been wiped out in the Wars of Beleriand. The only description of the Druidine is that they are small, troll-like woodsmen with quote-unquote unlovely faces, and with no mention of skin color. They kept to themselves on a part of the island of Numenor and had gone back to Middle-earth about the time of King Tar Aldarion, who was one king of Numenor. So basically long before whatever time period they're trying to represent on the show. Another weird thing is the portrayal of Ar-Pharazôn, who in the books is described as having the strength, stature, and will of the ancient heroes of the Edain. Here he just looks like a doughy politician. Definitely not the guy who's supposed to go conquer Sauron and his army. Another weird one is Miriel, who acts pretty xenophobic towards elves, which seems out of character. Little to nothing is spoken about her character in Tolkien's work, but her father, Tar Palantir, was the last Numenorian king to try and return friendship with the Eldar and belief in the Valar, so it seems odd that she would be so different than him. Also, Tar Palantir is still alive but has been ousted, even though in the books he died, and then when Miriel should have become queen, her cousin Pharazôn took her as his wife and named himself king. It almost seems like they're giving Tar Palantir part of the role of Amandil, the father of Elendil, who was the last lord of Andúnië. Andúnië is the westernmost part of Numenor and where the elves used to come and treat with the Numenorians until the time came when the kings of Numenor declared the elves their enemies. The lords of Andúnië were a branch of the original line of Numenorian kings, so Elendil is actually distantly related to both Miriel and Pharazôn, with Pharazôn having been friends with Amandil in their youth. So it's weird that Miriel and Pharazôn speak about Elendil as if he's just some Numenorian captain. Again, the compression of the timeline makes so much of this stuff unintelligible. Also in the books, Miriel was never Queen Regent, and the Rings of Power were forged roughly 2,000 years before she was even alive. However, her ancestor Tar Telperion was alive during the forging of the rings, so it seems like maybe they're not only compressing time, but also mixing different characters together. They also mention how the Numenorians and the elves have been estranged since the time of her grandfather's great-grandfather, which is correct. Ar-Adunakor was the first Numenorian king alive when the persecution of the elves really kicked off. However, it also doesn't make sense with the compression of time because that would have been hundreds, if not maybe a little over 1,000 years ago. Now, this feeling had been brewing for some time, as a few generations prior with King Tar Atanamir, who openly questioned the ban of the Valar, which said that the Numenorians cannot sail west to the Undying Lands. The reason being that the gift of men, which was also known as the doom of men, was to eventually die and have their spirits leave the bounds of the earth, though the Numenorians saw this as an insufficient answer and started to hate the elves, of whom alone were granted passage to the Undying Lands. Galadriel is acting extremely and uncharacteristically immature and hostile towards the Numenorians. Even Halbrand, who is a low man as the Numenorians call him, is more diplomatic than she is. Also, Elendil remarks that she is as brash and stubborn as his children, even though she is thousands of years older than Elendil himself. I've also heard the theories that Halbrand is actually Sauron in disguise, but there is no way that Sauron would put up with Galadriel's shit. Or that of Muriel, by the way. Why are the strong female characters on the show so immature, stubborn, and hot-headed? Aren't those supposedly the traits of toxic masculinity? The only useful thing that Galadriel's done in this episode is figure out that the sigil we keep seeing is actually a map of Mordor. This is discovered in the Hall of Lore, located in what I assume is Andunier, but it might be somewhere else. They also find a script written in black speech saying that the building of Sauron's new fortress in Mordor was always a contingency plan if Morgoth was defeated, which seems dumb. In the books, there was never a mention of a contingency plan. Morgoth's sole purpose was destruction. And Sauron, after Morgoth's defeat, was asked to return to Valinor to receive punishment for aiding Morgoth, but he ended up hiding for about 500 years, after which he returned and convinced the elves to help him make the Rings of Power. But whatever, Amazon doesn't care about the timeline. Isildur is a cadet in the Numenorian army, soon to take on the sea trials, which would get him promoted, and even though he seems fairly skilled at seacraft, he wants to wait a season, instead longing for something on the western shores of Numenor. His father disagrees, saying that there is nothing for their family in Andunier, that the past is dead, and that Isildur will take on the sea trial. Isildur's brother Anarion is briefly mentioned, who it's implied may be in the west or is estranged from the family. It seems absolutely uncharacteristic of Elendil, one of the faithful, which are the group of Numenorians who still hold to the old ways to include their friendship with the elves, to say basically, fuck the past. Perhaps, or I guess not perhaps, he has to have a change of heart by the end of the series in order for him to end up in Middle-earth and joining the elves against Sauron. We also meet Ayadian, an original character for the series, who is the sister of Isildur and Anarion and has become an apprentice of the Builders Guild. Back in the Southlands, Arondir has been captured by orcs, and we find out that the orcs have been building a trench covered with tarps so that they can travel across the Southlands while avoiding the sun. The orcs are using human and elf slaves to dig the trenches, with Arondir meeting two of his fellow Sylvan watchmen. Together they craft a plan to escape, but it doesn't work out, with one of them getting his throat slashed. One makes it out of the trench, but is shot with arrows. And Arondir makes it to the edge of the trench after killing a poorly created CGI warg, which looks like a rabid hyena, but he is also yanked back into the trench. At the end, we get a brief shot from behind, as well as a blurry face shot of the being known as Adar, who seems to be leading the orcs, and this could be the current form of Sauron at this time, but I'm not going to say that with 100% certainty. Continuing with the storyline of Nori Brandyfoot, Poppy Proudfellow, and their pet homeless man, the Harfoots are having their pre-migration festival, and Largo Proudfoot, Nori's father, is worried about being left behind in the migration because of his broken ankle from the last episode, which I don't think I mentioned. The Harfoots discover the presence of the stranger, and Nori almost gets banished from the group, but Sadik Burrows lets her off. And even though the Proudfoot family is placed at the back of the caravan, the stranger helps them with their stuff, so it seemingly works out in the end. So I don't know about you guys, but the compression of the timeline is driving me insane. I have no idea how things are going to play out, even though I've read the appendices and the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and the history of Middle-earth. I know the Rings of Power will be made at some point and Sauron will be defeated, but otherwise, Amazon seems to have said, fuck the timeline. On the bright side, Numenor did look amazing and the orcs were done pretty well, so perhaps there is a glimmer of hope. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Also, hit that notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. I'll see y'all next time.